Historical epics of the 1960s and 70s were a breed apart, big, bold, and unapologetically ambitious, and among them stands Cromwell, 1970, a film that dared to dramatize one of the most politically charged and divisive figures in British history. Oliver Cromwell, the man who helped overthrow the monarchy, fought for the rights of Parliament, and ruled England as Lord Protector. Directed by Ken Hughes and starring Richard Harris as Cromwell and Alec Guinness as King Charles I, the movie aimed to capture the ideological clash that split 17th century England in half: the struggle between Parliament and Crown, Puritans and Royalists, freedom and authority. But what makes Cromwell fascinating isn't just its sweeping story. It's the bizarre twists behind the production, the historical liberties it took, and the real-world drama among its cast and crew. This wasn't just a movie, it was practically a battlefield of its own. So, settle in as we explore 10 weird facts about Cromwell, 1970, you never knew. Fact 1. Richard Harris wasn't the first choice for Cromwell. When most people think of Cromwell, they immediately picture Richard Harris thundering his speeches, eyes blazing, and commanding the screen with sheer force. But here's something strange: Harris was not the studio's first choice for the role. The producers initially courted several other big names, including Charlton Heston, Richard Burton, and Peter O'Toole. Each had already proven themselves in sweeping historical epics. Charlton Heston, for example, had led Ben-Hur to Oscar glory and played Rodrigo Diaz in El Cid. Burton had wowed audiences in Becket and Cleopatra, while O'Toole had practically redefined the epic genre with Lawrence of Arabia. So why didn't any of them end up in the role? Heston turned it down, reportedly unimpressed with the script's treatment of Cromwell. Burton was already committed to other projects, and O'Toole, by all accounts, wasn't interested in diving into yet another exhausting historical drama so soon after his dessert ordeal as Lawrence. This left Richard Harris a brilliant actor, but also one with a reputation. By the late 1960s, Harris was known in Hollywood as a fiery, unpredictable personality. Stories of his outbursts on set and his heavy drinking followed him everywhere. Some studio executives worried he was too volatile to portray Cromwell, a man who symbolized discipline, religious austerity, and uncompromising control. But it turned out to be a stroke of genius. Harris's fiery nature translated into a Cromwell who wasn't cold and calculating, but passionate, explosive, and alive with conviction. His speeches crackle with urgency. His confrontations with Alec Guinness's Charles I feel like a clash of titans, and his emotional intensity brought the historical figure closer to audiences who might otherwise have seen him as a stiff Puritan caricature. And here's an irony that makes this fact even stranger. Harris openly admitted in interviews that he didn't particularly like Cromwell as a person. He found the historical figure too severe, too humorless, and even tyrannical. Yet, Harris thrived on playing men he disagreed with. He once said that an actor's job was not to like his characters, but to understand and embody them. So while Heston might have played Cromwell as stoic and noble, Harris played him as a man of volcanic passion, making the film far more dramatic and memorable. In the end, the studio's gamble on Harris's unpredictability paid off with one of the most commanding performances of his career. Fact 2. Alec Guinness claimed he was tricked into playing King Charles I. If Harris brought the fire to Cromwell, Alec Guinness brought the ice. His performance as King Charles I is chilling in its restraint, dignified, tragic, and quietly powerful. But here's the weird part. Guinness later claimed he was tricked into playing the role in the first place. By the late 1960s, Guinness was already a legend. He had starred in The Bridge on the River Kwai, winning an Oscar for his performance. He had worked with David Lean on Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago. He was known for his versatility, his meticulous preparation, and his refusal to take roles he felt were beneath him. When producers first approached him about playing King Charles I, Guinness was reportedly uninterested. He didn't see much potential in playing what he thought was a minor supporting role, the doomed monarch who, after all, loses to Cromwell. Guinness preferred complex characters, not just historical symbols, but the producers cleverly downplayed the importance of Charles in the film. According to Guinness, they pitched it to him as a relatively small part, something he could knock out quickly without too much commitment, believing it would be an easy project. Guinness agreed. Then, he read the full script. To his surprise, Charles wasn't just a minor player, he was one of the central figures. His decisions, his pride, and his eventual downfall formed the backbone of the entire story. Guinness realized he'd been coaxed into a trap, as he later described it. Now, here's the irony. Guinness may have been reluctant, but his portrayal of Charles I became one of the film's greatest strengths. Where Harris gave Cromwell passion and anger, Guinness gave Charles quiet fragility and tragic inevitability. His performance in the trial and execution scenes where he maintains royal dignity, even as the world collapses around him, is often cited as the most moving part of the film. In fact, some critics argue Guinness overshadowed Harris, stealing the film with his understated performance. Harris roared. Guinness whispered, but in those whispers came the weight of centuries of monarchy crumbling before the viewer's eyes. Guinness himself remained ambivalent about the film. In later years, he rarely mentioned Cromwell in interviews, preferring to discuss roles he was more personally invested in. But audiences remember his Charles I as one of the most poignant depictions of the doomed king ever put to screen. So, while Guinness may have felt tricked, cinema history benefited. Without him, Cromwell might have been all fire and no balance. With him, it became a true dual passion versus dignity, revolution versus tradition, Harris versus Guinness. Fact 3. The script was rewritten for nearly 15 years before filming began. If Cromwell feels like a movie caught between history, politics, and spectacle, there's a reason it was rewritten, abandoned, and rewritten again over and over for nearly 15 years before cameras ever rolled. Director and screenwriter Ken Hughes had been obsessed with Oliver Cromwell since the early 1950s. He originally envisioned a massive, David Lean-style epic, something that would rival Lawrence of Arabia in scale, but rooted in English soil. He researched the subject meticulously, poring through historical records, diaries, and military accounts. Early drafts of the script were reportedly so detailed that they could have filled a 3-hour movie just on Cromwell's rise before the Civil War even began. But there was a problem. No studio wanted to touch it. Historical epics were risky, and Cromwell wasn't exactly a box office name in the same way Julius Caesar or Cleopatra might be. For years, Hughes kept tinkering, trimming the story, and reshaping it to be more accessible to audiences. At one point, he even considered turning it into a television miniseries before the idea of a feature film resurfaced. By the mid-1960s, after the international success of Beckett and A Man for All Seasons, suddenly there was renewed interest in historical dramas about English politics. Hughes seized the moment, dusted off his script, and pitched it again, this time with more focus on the personal clash between Cromwell and Charles I rather than the broader political upheavals. That angle finally convinced Columbia Pictures to invest. But here's the kicker. Even during filming, Hughes couldn't stop rewriting. Richard Harris once complained that pages of dialogue would change overnight, and actors had to scramble to memorize entire new speeches the morning of shooting. Alec Guinness, ever the professional, quietly fumed at what he saw as Hughes's lack of discipline. He believed the constant rewrites muddled the clarity of his character. Yet, ironically, those rewrites may have helped. The final film is more accessible than it might have been, condensing years of complex English history into a tight duel of personalities. Yes, historians tore it apart for inaccuracies, but audiences got a story they could follow. So, in a strange way, 15 years of rewrites, frustrations, and last-minute changes produced a flawed but fascinating epic one that straddles the line between fact and dramatic fiction. Fact 4. The film's battle scenes were built on chaos. Every great historical epic needs its big battle scenes, and Cromwell delivers in spades. But what you might not know is that the filming of those battles was almost as chaotic as the English Civil War itself. Ken Hughes wanted authenticity. He didn't want battles that looked clean or staged. He wanted mud, confusion, and the raw brutality of war. To achieve this, the production recruited thousands of extras, many of them from the British Army, to play the parliamentarian and royalist soldiers. Real cavalry units were also brought in to recreate the famous cavalry charges that defined Cromwell's campaigns. Here's where things get wild. The special effects team used a staggering amount of real explosives for the battlefield cannon fire. Richard Harris recalled being genuinely shaken during filming because the explosions were so close that he could feel the heat on his face. Safety standards in the late 1960s weren't what they are today, and actors often had to trust that the pyrotechnics crew knew exactly what they were doing. The result? A few close calls. During one particularly intense scene, an extra fell from his horse after a blast went off prematurely. Another had his costume set alight from sparks. Thankfully, no one was seriously injured, but the story spread quickly among the cast, adding to the already tense atmosphere on set. And if the pyrotechnics weren't nerve-wracking enough, the weather played its own tricks. The film needed muddy, overcast landscapes to capture the grim tone of the war, but they often got blazing sunshine instead. To fix this, the crew sometimes flooded parts of the battlefield, sets to ensure the soldiers slogged through wet, heavy terrain. The extras hated it, but Hughes insisted it added realism. The sheer scale of these scenes helped Cromwell stand out. Unlike many epics that used miniatures or heavy editing to fake scale, these battles were fought with real men, real horses, and real chaos. Watching them today, you can still feel the raw physicality, and that comes from the fact that behind the camera, it was just as dangerous and unpredictable as it looks on screen. Fact 5. Oliver Cromwell's descendants criticized the film. One of the strangest things about Cromwell, 1970, is that it didn't just stir controversy among historians, it actually ruffled the feathers of Oliver Cromwell's own descendants. Cromwell is one of the most divisive figures in British history. To some, he's a hero who stood up to monarchy and fought for parliamentary rights. To others, he's a regicidal tyrant, responsible for brutal campaigns in Ireland and the eventual rise of Puritan authoritarianism. That division carried right into the 20th century, and the Cromwell family was still sensitive about how their ancestor was portrayed. When Cromwell was released, several descendants of the Lord Protector reportedly reached out to express disappointment at the film's liberties with history. They were particularly unhappy with the way Richard Harris's Cromwell was portrayed as a man constantly on the brink of rage, fiery, uncompromising, and almost unstable. According to them, the real Cromwell was far more complex. Deeply religious, yes, but also a pragmatic politician and military strategist who could be charming and persuasive when he needed to be. The film's version flattened those subtleties into a more Hollywood-friendly hero-villain dynamic between Harris and Guinness. But here's the twist. Some of Cromwell's descendants actually welcomed the film. A few argued that even with inaccuracies, at least it kept Cromwell's legacy alive in popular memory. After all, how many 17th century politicians get a lavish feature film made about them 300 years later? The debate sparked by the film mirrored the debate about Cromwell himself. Was he a hero of liberty or a dictator in all but name? By trying to simplify him into a movie character, the filmmakers accidentally reignited centuries-old arguments that still haven't been settled in England today. So in a way, Cromwell didn't just retell history, it stirred it back to life, even within the very family tree of the man at its center. Fact 6. Richard Harris and Alec Guinness couldn't stand each other on set. If you've ever watched Cromwell and felt a crackling tension between Richard Harris and Alec Guinness, that's not just good acting, it's real. Behind the camera, the two stars were famously hostile toward one another. Richard Harris was a fiery, passionate actor, known for his method-style intensity. He was unpredictable, larger than life, and often butted heads with directors if he felt his artistic vision wasn't being respected. Alec Guinness, on the other hand, was the consummate professional, disciplined, restrained, and precise. Where Harris thrived on chaos, Guinness thrived on control. The two styles clashed almost immediately. Harris accused Guinness of being wooden, saying his Charles I lacked passion or menace. Guinness, in turn, thought Harris was far too over the top, turning Cromwell into what he once described as a shouting schoolboy rather than a statesman. Things came to a head during scenes where the two had long debates across Parliament or during private confrontations. Harris would sometimes improvise lines or change his delivery dramatically, throwing Guinness off his rhythm. Guinness hated improvisation, believing the script should be honored exactly as written. At one point, Guinness even threatened to walk off set unless Hughes forced Harris to stick to the script. Director Ken Hughes was caught in the middle. He needed Harris's fire to make Cromwell larger than life, but he also needed Guinness's gravitas to ground the film. The feud between the two stars gave the movie its electric chemistry, but it also made production a nightmare. Later in life, Harris admitted that he respected Guinness deeply, even if they didn't get along. Guinness, however, never softened his opinion. In his autobiography, he described working on Cromwell as one of the least enjoyable experiences of his career. So when you see Cromwell and Charles I facing off on screen, remember, you're not just watching two characters fighting, you're watching two actors who could barely tolerate being in the same room. Fact 7. The costumes were so authentic, they nearly broke the budget. One of the things that gives Cromwell its epic feel is the incredible attention to costume detail. But what most people don't realize is just how much effort and money went into recreating 17th century fashion. The production team spent months researching paintings, portraits, and surviving artifacts from the English Civil War. They consulted historians on everything from the cut of Cromwell's plain Puritan clothing to the ornate lace and embroidery worn by Charles I's court. The goal was to make every frame feel like a living, breathing history book. But authenticity came at a cost. Thousands of handmade costumes were produced, many of them using materials that were historically accurate like real wool, linen, and even imported lace. These weren't cheap Hollywood imitations. They were heavy, hot, and difficult to move in, just as they would have been in the 16th century. The actors hated them. Richard Harris complained that the wool coats were suffocating during long days under hot stage lights. Alec Guinness's elaborate royal robes were so heavy that he had to be helped in and out of them between takes. One extra described the battlefield uniforms as wearing a carpet soaked in mud. And then there was the cost. The costumes alone nearly doubled the wardrobe budget. Columbia Pictures executives were furious when they saw the bills. But Hughes refused to compromise. He believed that without authentic clothing, the film would lose its sense of time and place. To his credit, he wasn't wrong. Even critics who slammed the movie for its historical liberties praised the costumes for their accuracy and grandeur. Today, some of those costumes still survive in archives and museum collections, where they're studied as examples of some of the best historical costuming work ever done in film. So, while the dialogue may not always be accurate, the lace collars and buff coats you see on screen are about as close to the real thing as you can get. Fact 8. The film was banned in several countries for political reasons. Here's a fact that often gets overlooked. Cromwell wasn't just controversial in England, it was outright banned in several countries. Why? Politics. The film tells the story of a commoner rising up against an absolute monarch, leading to the execution of a king. In countries where monarchies were still politically sensitive, this storyline was seen as dangerous. Spain, for example, refused to screen the movie during Franco's regime. The idea of showing a ruler being toppled and executed was simply unacceptable in a dictatorship that prided itself on strongman leadership. Similarly, in some Middle Eastern monarchies, censors banned the film outright, worried that it could be interpreted as propaganda against royal authority. Even in the UK, the film's release was tricky. The monarchy is a deeply ingrained part of British culture, and the execution of Charles I remains one of the most controversial events in national history. While the movie wasn't banned in Britain, it did face sharp criticism from royalists and conservative commentators. Some newspapers accused Hughes of being disrespectful to the crown by portraying Charles I as weak and indecisive, while elevating Cromwell as a heroic figure. Ironically, in other countries, the film was embraced precisely because of its revolutionary themes. In the Soviet Union, for example, audiences loved the idea of a film where the people rose up against a king. It was shown widely as an example of class struggle, even though the film itself was hardly Marxist in intention. This strange split reception shows just how politically charged Cromwell really was. It wasn't just a movie about history. It was a movie that touched a raw nerve in places where monarchy, dictatorship, or revolution were still part of living memory. So while Hollywood epics like Cleopatra or Ben-Hur sparked debates about money, Cromwell sparked debates about politics, censorship, and the legitimacy of rulers. A pretty strange legacy for a film that most people today just remember for its battle scenes. Fact 9. The film was slammed by historians for fantasy history. Every historical epic takes liberties, but Cromwell took so many that it practically caused a small academic revolt when it was released. Historians lined up to criticize the film for what they called fantasy history. For example, the film condenses timelines so dramatically that entire years of the English Civil War are compressed into a single battle. Characters who never met in real life are shown confronting each other directly. The movie even shifts Cromwell's motivations to make him appear more heroic and less politically calculating. One of the biggest sticking points? The trial of King Charles I. In reality, Cromwell was present, but not as central a figure as the film suggests. In Cromwell, Richard Harris dominates the trial, staring down Alec Guinness in a clash of wills. It makes for fantastic cinema, but historians argue it misrepresents the actual historical process, which was far more bureaucratic and less theatrical. Another major gripe was the portrayal of Cromwell himself. In the movie, he's a reluctant revolutionary who only takes up arms when pushed to the brink. In reality, Cromwell was a skilled political operator, deeply committed to Puritan ideals, and far less hesitant about wielding power. By softening his edges, the film made him palatable to audiences but infuriated experts. Even Oliver Cromwell's campaigns in Ireland, one of the darkest chapters of his career, are ignored entirely. For historians, this omission was unforgivable. By sidestepping those atrocities, the film painted a distorted picture of Cromwell as a noble reformer rather than a complex and divisive leader. Critics in academic journals wrote scathing reviews, calling the movie everything from misleading to dangerously simplistic. Some even argued that it did more harm than good, giving viewers the wrong idea about one of the most pivotal moments in English history. But here's the irony. While historians hated it, general audiences didn't care. They weren't looking for a lecture, they wanted drama, spectacle, and larger-than-life performances. And in that sense, Cromwell delivered exactly what Hollywood epics were meant to provide. So, in the end, the movie exists in a strange place. A film historians love to hate, but one that audiences of its time embraced as grand entertainment. Fact 10. Richard Harris later said it was one of his toughest roles. Richard Harris was never one to shy away from a challenge. Over his long career, he played everything from poets and warriors to wizards. But when asked about his toughest roles, he often mentioned Cromwell. Why? Because unlike many of his other parts, Cromwell was a figure who carried enormous historical baggage. Harris had to walk a tightrope between making the character human and not alienating audiences who might already have strong opinions about him. He admitted that he struggled with Cromwell's personality. Harris thrived on characters who were charismatic, flawed, and unpredictable. But Cromwell, as written in the script, was rigid, devout, and serious almost to a fault. Harris worried that the character would come across as dull unless he injected some of his own fire into the role. That's why his Cromwell often feels more passionate and more hot-tempered than the real man probably was. The long speeches were another challenge. The film is packed with orations, many of them modeled after Cromwell's actual writings and speeches. Harris had to memorize page after page of dialogue that wasn't just long, but also dense with political and religious language. He once joked that learning those speeches was harder than preparing for Shakespeare. On top of that, the physical demands of the role were punishing. Harris rode horses in battle sequences, marched in heavy wool costumes, and endured pyrotechnic blasts on muddy fields. For an actor who thrived on intensity, it was thrilling but exhausting. After the film's release, Harris admitted that while he was proud of the performance, it was one of the most draining experiences of his career. He even confessed that he never rewatched the movie in full, saying the memories of the production were enough. And yet, decades later, many fans still point to Cromwell as one of his most commanding performances. It may not have been his favorite role, but it showcased Harris at his most powerful a man, wrestling with history, passion, and faith, all on the grandest stage possible. Looking back, Cromwell, 1970, is a film that defies easy categorization. It's part sweeping epic, part political drama, and part old-school Hollywood spectacle. On one hand, it's riddled with historical inaccuracies, plagued by on-set feuds, and remembered with mixed feelings by its stars. On the other, it's a rare attempt to bring one of England's most complicated figures to life on the big screen. The film may not have the prestige of Lawrence of Arabia or the universal acclaim of A Man for All Seasons, but it has carved out its own niche in cinema history. With Harris's fiery performance, Guinness's quiet dignity, and Hughes's determination to capture the English Civil War in all its mud-soaked glory, Cromwell remains a fascinating if flawed epic. And maybe that's the real lesson. Just like the man himself, the film is divisive, passionate, and larger than life. You can criticize it, you can admire it, but you can't ignore it. So the next time you watch Cromwell, remember, behind every fiery speech and cannon blast lies a film full of strange stories, bold choices, and a legacy as complicated as the history it tried to tell.